So in this section, we've seen how Redux works and the basics behind incorporating it into our React applications. Now, what we've done may seem relatively straightforward to you, but in practice there are many questions that come up when using Redux, and frankly, there are many, for lack of a better word, wrong, ways to do things when working with Redux. In this video, we're going to look at a few of what I would consider best practices when working with React and Redux. Things to keep in mind to ensure that your React Redux applications work as expected and remain maintainable for the foreseeable future. The first of these best practices is when you connect components to the Redux store, your file should export both the unconnected and connected versions of that component. The reason for this is that the connected version of your component is usually what the rest of the application will want to use, but when testing your component, which is something I highly recommend by the way, it'll make your life a lot easier if you can simply test your component as is without having to create and set up a fake store in order to see how your component behaves under different circumstances. So really what I'm saying here is that from the point of view of your tests, it should be completely irrelevant if your component is actually connected or not. Your test should simply check to see whether or not your components render the correct JS given a specific set of props. The second best practice when working with Redux is that you should never trigger any other actions from inside your reducers or perform any kind of asynchronous operations such as fetching data from the network. I'm not going to go into too much detail about this here, but there is definitely a more correct way of doing these things, and we'll see exactly what this is very soon. For now, it's just important for you to remember that reducers are specifically meant to take the current state of the Redux store and combine it with an action to get the updated state, and that's it. The third Redux best practice is that we need to put some thought into which components we connect to the Redux store in our application. To be a little more specific here, we need to realize that connecting a given component to the Redux store has the potential to make that component less reusable from the point of view of the rest of our application. As an example, think about the to-do list component that we created earlier in the course. Right now, it's hardwired to display all of the to-dos in our Redux store. And this works, since that's how our application is designed right now, but what if we wanted to reuse this to-do list elsewhere in our app and display different collections of to-dos? For example, what if we wanted to have two separate lists, one that displayed all the completed to-dos and one that displayed all the incomplete to-dos? In this case, it wouldn't make as much sense to have our to-do list component connected to the store. It would make more sense to have some parent component that was connected to the store and have it simply display two identical to-do lists, but with different data. All of the completed to-dos for one, and all of the incomplete to-dos for the other. So, in other words, we should avoid connecting components to the store if we plan on reusing them throughout our app with different data. Instead, we should have some kind of parent component that's connected to the store and passes the correct data to these reusable components. Well, those are my top 3 best practices to pay attention to when using Redux in a React application. Obviously, there are many, many more, but what I've personally found is that at the end of the day, the most foolproof best practice is to use Redux a lot in many different situations and figure out what works best for you and what doesn't. This and this alone will give you a powerful intuition that'll help you use Redux to its maximum potential in whatever application you're building. Now that you've seen most of the basics of incorporating Redux into a React application, it's time for a little challenge. In previous videos, we implemented the entire Redux flow, action types, action creators, and reducers for 2 actions, creating and removing to-dos. One of the things we haven't done yet, however, is implement this flow for marking a to-do item as completed, and that's your challenge here. Your task is to create the flow for marking the to-do as completed, including the action type and action creator, adding a case to our to-dos reducer to handle this action, adding this action to our connection logic, and finally hooking it up so that the correct changes to the state are made when the Mark as Completed button is clicked. So that's your basic task. To be even more clear, here's what should happen. When the Mark as Completed button is clicked on a to-do item, the state should be modified so that the isCompleted property for that item is true. And as a further hint, you'll probably want to use the to-dos text as a unique identifier, just like we did with remove to-do. And just one last thing before we begin the challenge. In order to make it visible that a to-do has been completed, since we currently have nothing here that indicates this, why don't we use a to-do's is completed property to either show or hide the mark as completed button? That's fairly simple to do. It just looks like this. We're going to have a bracket and say to-do.isCompleted, and we'll just use a ternary operator here. And if a to-do is completed, we just want to return null here. And if it isn't, we want to show the mark as completed button. And let's add the closing bracket to the end here. And that's it. This challenge should take you about 10 minutes. When you've given it a try, feel free to move on to the next video where I'll show you how I solve this challenge. Okay, I'm going to show you how I solve this challenge. Keep in mind that the code I'm going to write in this video will continue to be a part of this project, so if you did yours a little differently, you might want to rewrite it to make it more similar to mine, or just keep in mind that things like variable names in your project might be a little different going forward. So with that in mind, I followed a very similar flow as what we used for removing and creating new to-dos. I started off with actions.js, and I added a new action at the bottom. I started off by creating an action type. I said export const, mark to-do as completed, and set that equal to a string, mark to-do as completed. And then I made the action creator, export const, mark to-do as completed. And I made that take the text of the to-do that we want to mark as completed as an argument. So text, and then that's going to return an action with the type mark to-do as completed, and a payload which has an object with that text property in it. So now that we've got the mark to-do as completed action creator and action type, I added a new case to our reducer. So I opened up reducers.js, and underneath the remove to-do case, I added another case. I said case mark to-do as completed. And then of course we have to import that too. And inside this case, I got the text property from the payload, very similar to what we've done with the other actions. Const text equals payload. And then what I did is I said return state, and then I mapped each to-do item. I said state.map to-do, and if the text of that to-do, if to-do.text was equal to the text of the payload, then what I did was returned the to-do with the isCompleted property set to true, which looks like this using the spread operator. Return ... to-do is completed true. Otherwise, for the rest of the to-dos, I just left them untouched. And that's pretty much it for the reducer. After that, I opened up to-do list and imported the action creator that we just made. So I add mark to-do is completed. And then down here in map dispatch to props, I added a prop called on completed pressed. And what that did was take the text of a to-do and dispatch our mark to-do is completed action with that text. And then I went up to the top here and added that to the props of to-do list. And what I did then was simply pass that onCompleted pressed function down to the to-do list items. OnCompleted pressed equals onCompleted pressed. And then the last step in hooking up this flow was to open up to-do list item.js, add the onCompleted pressed prop that we're passing to it, and add that to the onClick method of our completed button. OnClick equals onCompleted pressed with the text of the to-do. And that should be pretty much it. If we run our application now by saying npm run dev and open it up in a window, and you may have to refresh it because we made some pretty big changes. We'll say hello. And if we click on mark as completed now, we see that that button disappears, which means that that to-do is now completed. Congratulations if you figured out how to do that. Previously, we saw how adding Redux to our React application furthered our goal of separation of concerns by giving us a centralized, controlled way of managing state through actions and reducers. And basically what this means is that our components no longer have to worry about controlling their own states. And this is great, since it means that the business logic for what sort of state transformations are allowed to take place and how they take place is no longer contained inside of our component files. And this simplifies our components conceptually, as well as in terms of the number of lines of code they contain. However, even with Redux in place, our components still have to contain the logic for doing all the asynchronous operations, such as fetching or updating server data. We call these sorts of operations side effects. Now, conceptually, we want our components to have only one concern: correctly displaying the data we give them. So these side effects should be moved out of our components if possible, and of course it is possible by using what are referred to as side effect libraries in our applications. There are several side effect libraries that are available to React developers. Two of the most popular ones are Redux Thunk and Redux Saga. Now, despite the somewhat cryptic names, the goal of these side effect libraries is more or less the same: to give us a way to separate the side effects of our application from our components. So in terms of relative popularity, that is, in terms of GitHub stars at least, Redux Saga is in a pretty big lead. However, because of the relative simplicity and smaller learning curve of Redux Thunk, we're going to be covering Redux Thunk in this course. But just understand that if at some point in the future you want to look into Redux Saga or some other side effect library instead, they're all used to solve roughly the same set of problems as Redux Thunk.